you, Mr. Miller. With that definition of pilgrim, we could say that Ruth was a pilgrim. That God had sent her on a journey and prepared a person there to meet her. And his name was Boaz. In our last chapter of Ruth, chapter 4, I'm just going to read a brief verse from here. Let us listen for the word of the Lord. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Would you please pray with me? Lord God, we thank you for this opportunity to hear from your word once more, this chance to hear a pilgrim's journey and to see where you are directing us. Remind us, Lord, of your continued presence with us and that you prepare a path before us. For it's in your name we pray. Amen. So we've had chapters 1, 2, and 3 of Ruth. Now we're on chapter 4. So we've moved on, we've moved forward, we've moved in, and now we're moving up. Moving up in the world, so to say. Moving up in our understanding of the world, perhaps. See, our chapter for today starts out with Boaz. And Boaz, we learn, is indeed a man of action, as he claimed to be. Naomi said this at the end of chapter 3, that surely he will not rest until he has redeemed the family. So chapter 4 starts out with Boaz on a mission. He is seeking the nearest kinsman to Naomi in order that Ruth and Naomi's life situation can be worked out and improved once and for all. So Boaz heads to the gates of the city, the place where people gathered to do business, to socialize, and of course to hear the latest gossip. Much like town squares of olden times, the city gate was a place to be if you wanted to be someone. If you were seeking someone out, the city gate was the place to find them. So he goes to this center of the city, and he arrives and calls out to the near kinsman and says, "Have a seat next to me." We learn very quickly that this is not just a social visit, because Boaz then gathers 10 more elders from the city and has them to sit down as well. When he has them sit down, it's a symbol of them getting down to business. It was a symbol of the seriousness of the moment. He explains to them that there's a piece of land that Naomi, widow of Elimelech, is selling. And as the nearest kinsman, this gentleman, whose name we never learn, has the right to purchase first. Boaz states in no uncertain terms that if this unnamed kinsman is not willing, Boaz is more than willing to purchase the land. Now, at first glance to this unnamed kinsman, it looks like a great deal. Think about it. He's offered the chance to buy a piece of land from a childless widow. This land would increase his property and would add to the inheritance that he could leave to his children. It seems like a cut and dry situation. So in verse 4, we see that he quickly agrees to redeem the land. Now, if we didn't know the rest of the story, if we were hearing it for just the very first time, we would be shocked. Everything in the book of Ruth up until this point leads us to believe that Boaz should be the one to come out the winner. But now, in this moment, verse 4, it looks like this unknown kinsman is going to make off with the last little bit of land that Naomi owns, the last thing she has of Elimelech and her children. The The kinsman's easy reply should also make us question what's going to happen to our heroines. But Boaz is prepared for that reply. He's not surprised by it. After all, buying land from a widow with no family is a no-brainer. However, Boaz has a surprise of his own. Verse 5 tells us that Boaz informed the kinsman that on the day you acquire the field from the hand of Naomi, you're also acquiring Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead man, to maintain the man's name on the property. The kinsman immediately reneges on his commitment in shock at this addendum to the purchase of the land. Here's where things get a little bit tricky. Some scholars have suggested that ownership of the land and marriage to Ruth were interconnected, that they lean upon the idea of levirate marriage that's discussed in the first chapter of Ruth. That idea that if a son dies without leaving an heir, that wife is to marry the brother to raise up an heir for the one that passed. They say that in Naomi and Ruth's time, the idea of levirate marriage included the next of kin, not just your brothers living in the same household. But if that's true, then why would the kinsman change his mind about the land after Ruth's name had entered into the equation? Wouldn't he have expected the levirate marriage to go along with the property? Wouldn't he have expected to marry Ruth? Scholar Kathleen Farmer takes issue with the levirate marriage line of thought in her commentary on Ruth. She says, these interpretations of this interchange between Boaz and so-and-so can vary widely because the word that was written one way in the consonantal text is vocalized another way. So the original consonants in verse 5 imply that Boaz says, on the day you acquire the land, I will acquire the dead man's widow. This interpretation would certainly explain the shock and change of heart on the part of the unknown kinsman. You see here, Boaz has gathered a group of men for a legal transaction. He has witnesses, and he is ready to roll. The unnamed kinsman who thought he was getting a bargain has just been thrown for a loop. Instead of getting property that won't have an heir to claim it, even in the year of Jubilee, he has been told that Boaz intends to raise a child, an heir for Elimelech, through marrying Ruth. This is too much for the kinsman redeemer. He can't risk being cut off. He can't risk being out the cost of the land and then later the land itself. He can't risk gaining land for his family only to have them potentially lose it later. And so, for the sake of preserving what he has, he chooses to give up the rights of redeemer. He chooses to let Boaz claim both Ruth and Ruth's property. You see, this negotiation, as it turns out, was never really about a piece of land. It was about Boaz doing the right thing and announcing his plans publicly to marry Ruth. Throughout the book of Ruth, Boaz goes beyond all expectations. He greets his workers with respect and blessings. He gives Ruth permission to glean even among the sheaves and shares his own food with her. When Ruth goes to Boaz on the threshing room floor, he covers her with his cloak and sends her home before morning so that both of their reputations will remain above suspicion. He gives her food to take to Naomi, to assure her of his intention to provide for them both. And now, Boaz has gathered the elders and made these plans publicly known. Time and time again, Boaz proves himself to be a man of great character, seeking to do what is right. This honor puts him in direct contrast with the kinsman, who, quite honestly, comes off as selfish and greedy. And probably the authors intended us to read the kinsman this way. The kinsman and Boaz, well, they're supposed to be opposites. And as a sign of their agreement, they exchange a sandal. Not exactly the way we seal agreements nowadays, but they seal it publicly in front of witnesses. And Boaz again states that he will marry Ruth and tells the crowd that they are witnesses to these events. The crowd echoes his words, agreeing that they are witnesses to the refusal of the kinsman, to the sale of the property, and, importantly, to Boaz's pledge to marry Ruth. We learn in verse 13 that Boaz does indeed fulfill his promise to marry Ruth. And they're blessed almost immediately with a child. Not just any child, a male child, an heir. This is significant for so many reasons. Boaz and Ruth have indeed produced an heir for Elimelech, a male child to pass on the family. Naomi, a barren, empty widow, is given a son through her Moabite daughter-in-law. And Ruth, who was barren throughout her 10 years of marriage, quickly becomes full as the mother of David, or the mother of the grandfather of King David. Sorry. It's an amazing end to an amazing story. Out of the emptiness, the famine, the barrenness, the widows come to fullness of life as they continue the line of ancestry which will eventually lead us to Christ, the King. What an amazing story of the fullness of God's blessing. There's such a richness in the story of Ruth, which deserves so much more time to really get into. But there's some really important factors to be looked at. Specifically about Boaz and how we can be redeemers as well. In our society, people bend, twist, and blatantly break the rules every chance they get. Sometimes we break the rules in simple ways, like not stopping all the way at a stop sign or going over the speed limits. And sometimes in more complex ways, like fraud, money laundering, tax evasion. People try to get ahead in any way possible, often not thinking about or caring about who they may hurt in the process. It seems to manifest itself pretty clearly, overwhelmingly even, in financial dealings. And with such dealings, there seems to exist an overwhelming desire for more power, more money, more property, for as much as possible, no matter the means. Often the deals are negotiated behind closed doors, and investors and the public alike are kept in the dark as long as possible. That's not how Boaz operated. Boaz conducted his business in the light of day, in the hub of the action of the city of Bethlehem. He had witnesses. He went above and beyond what was expected of him. And through his actions, Ruth and Naomi were saved. We could learn a lot from Boaz's dealings with the world. Too often there's a temptation to act less than honorably. We're tempted to lie when we're uncomfortable with the truth. We're tempted to bear false witness when it might be in our best interest to hide some things. And if you don't feel any of these pressures, that's wonderful. It's great. But you only have to watch television advertisements for TV shows or read the headlines in the checkout line in the tabloids to know that these temptations exist in our world. They're there. But God calls us to a life lived in the light, where we are above board and clear with our intentions. Boaz also can teach us how to treat the outcast in our world, the unwelcome. Boaz was an upstanding man in his community. He had the respect of the elders of the town, or else he wouldn't have been able to gather 10 of them to sit down and witness his transaction. He was a man held in high regard. But he was also a man who showed wonderful, exemplary behavior towards Ruth, a Moabite woman, an outsider. She had arrived uninvited in his field, and yet he welcomed her and gave her special privileges. He didn't mistreat or misuse her, but rather he sought to protect and provide for her. It always reminds me a little of the story of the man, of a man at one church. It's a story that I think I might have actually told here before, but it's a good one, so I'll tell it again. There was one Sunday morning, and halfway through the service, the doors opened, and a young man walked down the center aisle. He was wearing shredded jeans, a dirty t-shirt. He smelled of unwashed body and booze. He walked all the way down the center aisle and sat on the floor, right in front of the preacher. Everyone looked around, unsure of what to do. "What should we do with this man?" they whispered. "I don't know." Slowly, a man in the back of the church made his way down the aisle with his cane. Everyone knew this man. He was an elder in the church, well respected and tough as nails. They all breathed a sigh of relief as he approached the young man. They all thought, "He's got this. He can handle it." And the elder reached the front of the church and leaned his cane against the front pew, and everyone was prepared to see him wrench that young man up. But instead, he lowered himself onto the floor next to the newcomer. The congregation was shocked. They'd all expected him to kick the young man out, but instead he sat down next to him as a welcoming gesture, welcoming him as a friend and equal. We too are called into the service of God by serving those who are unlike us, serving those who are in need, serving those who have been rejected. It's often easy for those who call ourselves children of God to exclude those we think of as other or different. But we have to remember that it's often the other whom God has called into service to bring about his will. Ruth was an other in every sense of the word, but God prepared her to bring about the Christ child. We must remember that it is indeed possible that God would use one of these outsiders to show us where we are in need of tolerance, in need of love, in need of redemption ourselves. Let us remember that we are others too. Yet God has called us into the family to be equal parts, to be loved, and to share that love with all we meet.